topics and opinions expressed on the following show are solely those of the hosts and their guests and not those of W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. We make no recommendations or endorsements for radio show programs, services, or products mentioned on air or on our web. No liability, explicit or implied, shall be extended to W4WN Radio, its employees, or affiliates. Any questions or comments should be directed to those show hosts. Thank you for choosing W4WN Radio.
This is Beyond Confidence with your host, Divya Parekh. Do you want to live a more fulfilling life? Do you want to live your legacy and achieve your personal, professional, and financial goals? Well, coming up on Divya Parekh's Beyond Confidence, you will hear real stories of leaders, entrepreneurs, and achievers who have stepped into discomfort, shattered their status quo, and are living the life they want. You will learn how relationships are the key to achieving your aspirations and financial goals. Moving your career or business forward does not have to happen at the expense of your personal or family life, or vice versa. Learn more at www.divyaparekh.com, and you can connect with Divya at contact@divyaparekh.com. This is Beyond Confidence, and now here's your host, Divya Parekh.
Good morning, listeners. So thrilled to be here with you because I get to talk to you. And holidays are just around the corner, and there is magic in the air. Here's what I'm going to share with you. I want to share that it's important to have that sense of gratitude in your heart, because gratitude, in my experience, is the ultimate gift that you can give to yourself. So be sure to have that gratitude in your heart and count your blessings. So I want to count you as one of my biggest blessings because you have been wonderful. And I want to thank each and every one of you who have got our books, whether it's Expert to Influencer, which will help you become the influencer, not just with numbers and likes or followers, but an influencer who creates a positive impact, who brings meaning to people's lives. Or the Entrepreneur's Garden, that is going to help you build that relationship with yourself, whether you're an entrepreneur or a professional or a human being, because it helps you develop that relationship with yourself and with the important things like results, time, money that will change your life. And thank you for getting our books, because partial profits from our books go to kiva.org. And keep the kindness circle going. If you can spend 1 hour of your time every month without any agenda, without anything else on your mind, and help somebody out, that would be amazing. So let's bring in our guest, Dr. Angela Lauria. Welcome.
Hello, thanks for having me.
Oh, it's a joy to have you here. So do you recall a moment from your childhood that still stands out for you today? It can be a person, it can be a situation, anything.
Well, one came to mind, and it's an interesting little story because now I'm a late diagnosed autistic, and now I can see so much autism in it. But I was picked to be Mary in our school Christmas play, and there was like a baby doll that they had me hold that was supposed to be Jesus, and I was in this Christmas play. I don't know if we were singing songs or what, and I was rocking this doll. And for years, it was a joke in my family that I almost rocked the baby off the stage because I was just rocking so much because I was nervous, which in autistic culture, we call stimming. So we do a lot of rocking and proprioceptive movements to create emotional regulation. And what I would say is my childhood was this mix, sort of like my adulthood, of always being featured as the star, right? Like I got the lead role at 5 years old in the nativity play. Angela has so much confidence, we'll put her right on stage. But then also learning how to stay emotionally regulated in those moments. And that has been kind of one of my biggest challenges, because I am very confident. I'll put myself out there, but then I'm like, whoa, did I mean to do that? This is scary. So I think that is kind of my quintessential first beyond confidence childhood memory.
And what you said was so beautifully put, that it's that beautiful mix of it, that there's that confidence that gets you out there, and yet there is something that's holding you back, and yet you tackle it and help it bring together. And
Yeah.
that's beautiful.
Well, and I think that relationship, it's almost like a cyclical relationship. I naturally want to try new things, but then they're uncomfortable. So then
Mhm.
I'm like, well, maybe I should not try new things because I don't want to feel uncomfortable, because who does? But then I'll have inspiration from God or source or however you think of it that'll be like, do this thing. And I'm like, oh, here we go again. It's much more comfortable on my couch with a book, but okay.
Here's the thing, most people are uncomfortable
Yeah.
with most of the things because think about it, we love our routines. Most of people might, oh gosh, before I don't have them my coffee in the morning, I'm not going to be awake. And if we take a look at our lives, everybody has something or the other that they need in their lives. And it's hard to break that mold.
Hmm.
So what you're sharing is it's applicable to everyone. So as you continued growing and in your childhood, because you were not diagnosed, were there moments in your youth that it was a challenge,
Oh, yeah.
the crowd?
Yeah. Yeah. So one of the things we would tell autistic kids or parents of autistic adults now is to let them stim because it helps them regulate, let them rock. And what we used to tell, and like nobody did anything wrong. I'm 50 years old. We didn't know that girls had autism and that it looked different. No one should have
Right.
caught me. It wasn't happening. I'm not mad at anyone. There's nothing to
Mhm.
forgive. But what we would say now is maybe don't make fun of the rocking and maybe even encourage the rocking because it's creating a calmness and a connection to the body that I didn't have because I don't have good awareness of my body. That's called interoception.
Mhm.
And so that was creating that connection. So what happened and what happens to a lot of autistic people, because I was sort of told to sit on my hands, don't rock so much, don't be difficult, don't make a scene, don't
Oh,
flap your hands, don't do all those things, which everyone was just wanting the best for me. Nobody was
right,
saying
right,
that to be
right.
terrible. What that creates is emotional dysregulation. And
Mm,
so I would regularly have what we call autistic meltdowns. So I would have flip outs. So for instance, I remember another time in school, maybe a lot of times in school, where I felt strongly my teacher was wrong about something. The example that's coming to mind was my teacher was saying Mexico is in Central America.
mm,
And I was arguing that it was in North America. It's in North America. I was right.
mhm.
And so I kept interrupting the teacher. Like I would not let the class go on until the record was clarified. How can we pay attention to anything
Mm,
if Miss Greco does not apologize for putting Mexico in Central America instead of North America, which I
mhm.
now see wasn't that important, but I had this huge meltdown. I didn't get suspended, but I got sent down to the principal's office. There were all these interventions, like so many well-meaning people telling me that's not how to behave. And
Mm.
I was perpetually in this state of confusion because she was teaching geography.
Right.
How can the geography teacher be wrong? I know that's wrong. I know that's wrong because I read the entire encyclopedia multiple times. So I know where Mexico is. I have that entry memorized. And
Mhm.
so that disconnect had me in constant fights. One of my teachers, he has since died, so I will call him out here, but Mr. Harris, I can't remember what I did, but he was an English teacher, and
Mhm.
I must have driven him so crazy that he threw me against the lockers.
Oh,
Just
no.
slammed me against lockers. One of my
Oh, my
favorite
goodness.
teachers, Mrs. Crockett, and there are many autistic women who tell this exact same story. Mrs. Crockett was like, I love this girl. She is super smart and she's completely disrupting my class. I have 30 kids trying to learn 6th grade English.
Mm,
And this girl will not stop talking. I would not stop talking. They would always call me Chatty Cathy, like, and
mm,
so she put me in an 8th grade English curriculum and she
mhm,
moved my desk to the hallway.
mm,
And I taught myself 8th grade English in 6th grade while sitting in the hallway.
mm,
And many autistic, particularly women, experience this where either in a nice way, you're completely excluded, called a weirdo, and moved out into the hallway, or in a frustrated way, you're thrown
so
against the
sorry you had
lockers
to
or
go through
sent to
that.
the principal or so, but I have this confidence that I was right,
Mhm,
which will also often get diagnosed in women as either narcissism or bipolar, which is a
mm,
misdiagnosis and a frequent misdiagnosis, because I knew Mexico was in North America. I knew
mm,
whatever I was arguing with whoever was right. And it without the supports, and now there are much better supports in most schools, but
mhm,
without those supports, I was in this constant state of confusion, depression, anxiety, and the things that would make me feel better, like stimming or focusing on my special interests, I was told not to do because they were weird. Like, don't talk about
mm,
the fact you read the encyclopedia. By the time I got to middle school, all of my friends, my only friends, were the reference librarians at my library. And I had to go to the library because I only wanted to read reference books. I just wanted to read encyclopedias. So by middle school, I was reading the Encyclopedia of Contemporary Authors, which was like
mm,
100 volumes of bios of every author. Books have always been my special interest. And I was told, don't talk about that. That's weird. But then I was also told academics are good and get good grades and authors are good and the library is good. So I'm like, wait, is it good or bad? So
yeah, so it was confusing because on one hand you're being told one thing and one thing, it's finding that balance, and it
yeah, and
can
it just
how it
didn't make
can be
sense.
confusing to a young child.
Yeah, there would be a thing. This was a major thing for me in school. Class participation is 10% of the grade. I really want you
Mm,
to participate. So I just talked all through class. I'd come in with presentations. I was ready to teach on every subject. And then I would be told, don't participate. And I'm like, but you told me
mm,
it was 10% of the grade. You didn't say how much it was. I thought it was the more the better. You keep
right.
saying you. So then the teacher would be talking to the class. She'd be like, everyone, I'd like you to participate. So I thought she was talking to me because I was in the class. So I would
Mhm,
participate. She'd be like, Angela, please be quiet. Turn your desk around. Go sit at the back of the room. So yes, it's
mm.
interesting being an undiagnosed autistic because those are very common occurrences that people like me that are diagnosed, I was diagnosed at 39, will share these experiences and they're so similar.
It's about having that clarity. So the more clarity is provided to anyone, then it's clear like what is expected. On
Right.
one hand, what does that participation look like? Sharing that to people, sharing it to kids, wherever anybody is, so that way that confusion is not there. So that said, and you thank you for sharing your stories. And I'm sorry you had to go through
Mm,
that. And at the same token, I see it has made you a very, very strong person. And now you're out and about
true.
advocating and sharing your stories and bringing that vulnerability to people. So that shows a lot of courage. So I do appreciate that. And I would like to acknowledge you for that.
Yeah, thanks. It was other people sharing their stories that helped me find the truth about who I was. And so I know maybe it's your kid, maybe you're listening and you're like, oh, my kid does that. That's why they're getting in trouble at school. Or maybe it was your sister. For years, my sister thought I was a narcissist and we didn't really
Mm,
talk much. And then once I started to understand what autism was, and she learned just a few tools to support the neurodivergent people that you love. We make up about 15% of the population. So someone you love or work with is neurodivergent. And if they are driving you nuts in some of these ways, understanding kind of our neurology will help you to build better relationships and probably be less frustrated with us.
It's important that we open up our hearts to everyone, because I can tell you, I've got my own quirks, plenty of quirks. So it's definitely. So let's say you talked about there are a lot of neurodivergent people, and it is. So how do people, well, before we get there, let's come back to your story. So tell us, you were absolutely very, very smart, as you've shared from your story. So what career did you take on in your college, and where did you go from there? And tell us a little bit about your journey from there to here.
Yeah, one of the things about autism, again, I did not know this, is we have a very strong sense of social justice and sensitivity to justice and fairness. That is often the negative way that's described, is we're very black and white thinkers. But in 8th grade, I was skipping school to attend apartheid rallies. So yes, I started my first nonprofit when I was 13 to raise money for Live Aid for the famine in Africa, and was always very interested in social justice and also journalism. And so I majored in journalism. I wanted to be an investigative reporter, and ended up actually getting a job in my field. So I worked for some of the most famous investigative reporters, Pulitzer Prize winners, helping them with books. So I did a book on the Iraq War. I did a bunch of espionage books when I started. And so, yeah, I majored in journalism, which was my special interest. It was sort of a cross between writing and investigative journalism, which were two of my special interests. And then I moved into working on books, which is what I do today. I run Difference Press. I help people to write books. I'm a ghostwriter. I have editing services. I have publishing services. And I've been doing this since I was 20 years old, and I'm 50 now. I don't know how it happened.
Well, that's fantastic. Congratulations.
What we know about autistic people is if you can find work in your special interests. So let's say you're really into trains and you know everything about trains, get a job working in trains, be a train historian, work in a train museum, like whatever your special interest is. And I've been able to do that, even though I thought it was just luck. But I do have a little family story about that. So autism is hereditary. My dad is autistic. We also figured that out late in life. But one of the big lessons to me growing up, one of our family stories, is my dad fell in love with hot rods when he was 12 years old. He saw his first Model T and he really wanted to buy one. So he bought a shoe shine kit. And he used to go to the church, St. Mary's Church in New Haven, and he would stand on the steps when church would get out, and he would sell shoe shines for a quarter. And he collected all those quarters, and by the time he was 16, he bought his first car. And by the time he was 18, he had started a company. He was very successful. My dad's in the Hot Rod Hall of Fame. He's done lots of famous people's cars and always made money, made a good living working on hot rods, on specialty cars. And so when I grow up, they say children learn what they live. So what I thought was when you were, 12 years old, you would find the thing you were most passionate about in the world. And then you would build a career doing the thing you loved most in the world and make lots of money doing it. I never considered anything else. And it's one of the greatest parenting lessons. And obviously, none of us knew anything about autism at the time, but that is the secret to happiness for a lot in work for a lot of autistic people, is to do what you love. Everybody says that, but it's not always as easy to do.
Right. And as you mentioned, one of the things that it's important to do what you want to do. Now, what happens is, in your case, you were diagnosed late, so you did not know that, and you had different type of challenges, and especially nowadays, with people are so much aware. People are very much into like, okay, my kid is here, let me get them diagnosed and see what's the best thing that I can do for my child. So now, as that child grows, how can they embrace their autistic or neurodivergent identity?
Yeah. So I think the first thing is the saying you hear over and over again. If you've met one autistic person, you've met one autistic person. Everyone has their own profile. All of us, whether you're autistic or not, everybody's brain is different. Everybody is different. And getting to know your own needs is important for everyone. The problem with neurodivergent people, and all neurodivergent means is if you imagine a bell curve, with every bell curve, 80% of the people are in the middle, 20% are on the ends, right? Neurodivergent people are just those people in the skinny part of the bell curve that are different. And so a lot of the advice that's out there, and this is one really specific thing. There is a very famous book right now called Atomic Habits. And it's like how to be productive. It's got habit stacking, how to create new habits, 21 days of repeating a habit. They've got all these great techniques. For most neurodivergent people, those techniques won't work. And so what happens is your teacher, the HR representative, the podcast you listen to are recommending these solutions. For instance, they might say the best way to deal with a conflict is to sit down with a person and tell them. That does not work for neurodivergent people. We have other ways of dealing with conflict. We work much better in writing, for instance. Many of us, not all of us. Some of us work better in pictures. So what happens is you hear this advice over and over again. And if this is you and you're a parent and this is your child, you're giving this advice of what to do. I would get a lot of advice about exercising. You should exercise 30 minutes 4 times a day. Like there's just best practices. That does not work for my proprioceptive needs. I get very sick from exercising. So there are ways I can exercise, but I struggle with being juggled. So if I'm like running, for instance, or doing any sort of cardio, I am going to go into vertigo and I'm going to be in bed very quickly because I'm super susceptible to vertigo, nausea that lasts for days. So yes, theoretically, 4 times a week, half an hour a day is great. Realistically, as a neurodivergent person, I now know I have to filter all the advice for what are the pros and cons for my neurology. And that's what you want to do as a parent, is to help your kid just get to know themselves, whether they're neurodivergent or not. My son, if he does not exercise at least 4 days a week, he is a hot mess of anxiety. He says it, I see it, he sees it. If he exercises every day, he has a lot less anxiety. That is fantastic. He should exercise every day. If I exercise every day, I am incapacitated, not working, and very anxious about the fact that I can't pay my bills. So that's not going to work for my anxiety. So when you hear like, this is good for, or this does this, or you can build a habit in 21 days, they are not talking to neurodivergent people. And knowing that makes it so much easier to not feel terrible about yourself when all this best practices advice doesn't work for you.
And that's definitely a good point, that filtering what you're sharing is that, yes, there's a lot of advice out there, but filtering. So first of all, knowing yourself, and then filtering the advice that works the best for you. Then always, every person has their strengths. So for neurodivergent people, how best they can leverage their strengths.
100%. I loved that book. This was right before I was diagnosed. I found the book Strengths Finder. Have you ever heard of that one?
Oh, yeah.
And I think they had a follow-up book called Now Focus on Your Strengths. Just the title even before I read the book or took their quiz, it's put out by the Gallup organization. But even before I knew any of that, just the phrase focus on your strengths brought me this immense sense of calm because I was so good at certain things, but I was so terrible at other things. And my whole life, I was told to focus on all the things I'm terrible at. I struggled with an eating disorder, struggled with my weight and my relationship with food. And the message was spend all your time focusing on fixing your weight and fixing your relationship with food and eating healthy. Now I am at my healthiest weight. I have a great relationship with food and I spend almost no time focusing on it. So focusing on my strengths was a big game changer for me.
Definitely. And you mentioned that it was an issue before, now it's not. So what did you do that it has become that routine where you don't even have to think about it?
So I embraced an autistic concept called same foods and safe foods. So if you think about a lot of kids who are picky eaters, and I was always a picky eater, a lot of kids who are picky eaters, their parents are like bribing them. Like if you have one more bite of vegetables, then you can watch a half an hour of TV or screen time, whatever we do with kids now. So I always felt like I ate badly and therefore I was bad. And then if I ate good, if I was a good eater, I would eat vegetables and meat and whatever all the rules were. But there are actually very few foods I eat. There's about 30 of them. They have enough nutrition, and I don't want to try anything new. I don't need to try new things. I always say cornflakes is as spicy as I get. That is like my maximum spice. I am super sensitive, so I am sensory avoidant. So to me, cornflakes taste very different than they taste to you. And so I know the foods I eat. I know what nutritional benefit I'm getting from them. I know what supplements I need, and I don't feel badly about myself for not being a good eater. I've kind of changed those definitions. So I stick with my same foods and my safe foods 90% of the time. And before I go to a restaurant, I'll look at everything they have and make sure there's something that's safe for me. I know it's going to use up units of energy if I try something new. So like last Christmas, I went to a chef's tasting dinner and I tried foie gras for the first time. And I don't know, other exotic foods. And I wanted to do that. It was a family outing. I can do that. I didn't enjoy it. I don't want to do it again. Like I didn't enjoy those foods, but I enjoyed the time with my family and the experience. But I had to rest all day and I had to plan to rest the next day. So that's not, but for some like foodie people, that's like the best night out. They could do it every night if they had the budget. So I have to really plan to experiment with food, but I also don't need to eat a bag of Oreos. They're not actually a safe food for me, but if they were, I don't need to eat a bag of Oreos to make myself feel better about being such a bad eater and having a bad relationship with food. Now I'll, even if it's something sweet, vanilla pudding is one of my safe foods. I'll have, one little cup of vanilla pudding. I don't need to eat the whole pack because I feel badly about not eating vegetables. So that story that I'm broken went away. And then I basically eat what I need for fuel. I'm not saying I'm skinny, but I was 350 pounds and I'm 180. So it's a remarkable difference when you realize like, no, you don't need to eat a variety of foods. You don't need to eat the rainbow. You don't need to eat the food pyramid. If the cost of doing those things is that you hate yourself and it makes you 350 pounds because you're so miserable and anxious. So it's good advice unless it's not for you.
Right. The key is what works for you. And that's applicable to anyone who's trying to change or knowing what makes you move forward, knowing yourself, basically. That's what you're going back to it, that the more you know about yourself, the more you can design your habits, your food. It doesn't matter. And you can keep on moving forward and achieving great things like you have done. So, can you kind of share, is there any harmful stereotyping that is around neurodivergent people?
Yeah. So I want to teach this little concept called double empathy.
Mm,
There is a lot of old, dated, and incorrect research out there that says autistic people are not empathic. They don't have empathy. This is work that was done by a guy named Simon Baron-Cohen, work on theory of mind, and autistic people, and there are some famous ones you might know, like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk. We are often known for being quite blunt, for
mm,
being rude, and what this is interpreted as is we have no empathy. So someone would come into Steve Jobs' office, he didn't like something they did, and he would just say, "You're fired, get out of my office." And people are
mhm,
like, "God, he has no empathy. Like, this woman has a family. She's been here 30 years. Oh, Elon Musk, when he fired 3,000 people over email, people are like, "I've
mhm,
worked here 20 years. Do you have no empathy?" So recent studies in the past 8 years, led by a guy named Damian Milton in the UK, have shown when you pair two autistic people together,
mhm,
both of them show empathy towards each other. And when you pair two non-autistic people, or what we call allistic people, together, they will show empathy to each other. They will find the other person has empathy. But when you pair an autistic person and an allistic person, they will say the other person doesn't have empathy.
hmm,
What this shows, and this study has been repeated over and over again in multiple cultures, is autistic people have empathy, allistic people have empathy, but we don't have empathy for each other because we don't understand our neurotypes.
mm,
So the reason why Elon Musk would have felt like the way he fired people was very empathetic was they knew it was coming. They'd been following in the news that there was going to be huge layoffs. He'd been interviewed and said he was going to lay off 75% of the workforce. He would think, you just want to get this over with and get on with your life and find out what the package is. And if I have to do phone calls with 3,000 employees personally, it's going to take a long time. You're going to find out already. It's going to be super awkward and it's a waste of your time. So the most empathetic way I can lay you off is by sending you an email all at the exact same time. Now, in autistic culture, that is the empathetic way to do it. That is
mhm.
high empathy. But in allistic culture, it's just this massive affront. So the biggest stereotype that we need to break about autistic people is we aren't empathetic. We are incredibly empathetic. We just see it differently than you. And if we
Mm,
understand that, we can bridge that double empathy gap.
definitely. And you mentioned initially, good, and going back to before, and I completely agree with you before we go to the next point, is that understanding people and what they're capable of. And if you understand them, it's much easier to accept people rather than cancel them or rather than say, oh, they don't have X, Y, and Z. And that goes for every human being. That's part of being a human, and having that humanity is understanding other people, that we all are different. And how can we come together to build that common connection? So you had mentioned earlier that several women go undiagnosed or
Yeah.
get misdiagnosed. So can you share like what's the reasoning behind that?
Yeah, well, there's a few reasons. So when I was growing up and I was born in the 70s, autism was first diagnosed in 1943 by Dr. Leo Kanner. So that diagnosis happened, and it happened to be a white male. And that scientist was also a white male at the time. That's just how things were. And so all of the early research tended to be done on white male boys. There's a famous exception around this time who's the first woman diagnosed, a woman named Temple Grandin, who a lot of people have heard of. There's a film about her life. Her mom was very advocated very hard to get her diagnosed. Her mom was extremely smart. I think she was from Wellesley. They were in Massachusetts. They were connected to the top autism research groups, and she figured it out. And her mom's kind of a little bit of the hero there, partly because they used to blame moms, mostly of autistic boys. They would call them refrigerator moms. And they would say, if your mom is cold, it will turn you autistic. Not what happens. It's hereditary. You are autistic for the same reason you have brown eyes. That's it. It's just hereditary. There's no vaccines. That's a complete lie. It's not the food you eat. It's not Monsanto. It's not social media. You are autistic for the same reason you're 5'5". Like, just, it's genetics. That's the answer.
So it's like getting people educated. It sounds like is really, really important. So yeah, please continue.
All those studies were done on wealthy white boys. And so there are a bunch of ways that autism presents in men because of sexism and the patriarchy. So for instance, boys will be obsessed with trains or trucks or traps. And that was just sort of seen as a boy thing. But if a girl got obsessed with something, they would be told they needed to do the dishes or clean the kitchen or help their mom with the vacuuming. Again, we're in the 50s, 60s, 70s here, right? And so girls were socialized differently. So we are what is called generally, everybody's different, but high masking. So in order to survive in our family, no one could find out about our special interests. So obviously I was very obsessed with reading, and I would sit in my closet and read because it wasn't seen as, like, I read too much. It was seen as weird. Does she always have to have her head in a book? By the way, famous undiagnosed autistic girl, Belle from Beauty and the Beast. And that song about Belle, about how she's walking around the town and everyone in the town thinks she's weird and she's reading a book. She, like me, is a linguistic autistic. That is what autistic girls look like. So maybe you think we're nerdy or shy or booky or awkward. But that can be a sign of masking. So that's what happened at the beginning. All of the studies were done on boys, so they didn't recognize how autism shows up in girls and also in people of color and also in poor people. Because, like, if you're dealing with poverty and you need to get a meal, and the easier way to get a meal requires masking your autism symptoms, you are much more likely to mask. So poverty has a huge, it's very intersectional what all the different effects are. Now there are much more robust studies. And since the 90s, we've been diagnosing women, but that means that there's a whole bunch of adult women and people of color and people with other intersectionalities that were never diagnosed younger because they weren't part of those studies. So that's the number one biggest reason that people still see it as a boy's illness. And that is for sure changing.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And as we're getting closer to wrapping up our show, what could people do to make environment safer and inclusive for neurodivergent people?
Well, I think the number one thing is to see if you automatically feel like somebody is being difficult or blunt in their communications or too black and white or asking too many questions or asking for instructions. It is knowing we just have a different communication culture. So because we make up 15% of the population, just like blue-eyed people, it's a recessive gene. We know that now. If everybody, every single person that interacts with humans, you are interacting with neurodivergent people. So learning this different communication style isn't bad, and just being able to recognize, oh, that person has a direct communication style without jumping to the conclusion, oh, that person is a jerk. That person
Mm.
isn't kind. Just, I mean, what's that thing they say when you assume you make an ass out of you and me? That assumption that people have that blunt or direct communication is coming from a destructive place. That is not who autistic people are at all. We're asking questions or we're bluntly stating. So, for instance, in autistic culture, if you would say, do you want to get Indian food tonight? I might answer you, no. I would always say yes. I actually like Indian food. But I would just say no. And you might think that person's rude. That person didn't appreciate my request. No, literally your question was, do I want Indian food? The answer is no. So blunt, or I might say, what kind of Indian food? From what restaurant? How long is the drive? Whose car are we going in? That's because I'm trying to deal with some of my sensory sensitivities. I know I'm going to get car sick. I don't want to get car sick on the way back after we had Indian food. Is it a long drive away? So your assumption about questions or direct answers, very often neurotypical people will add a whole bunch of color. This person doesn't like me. They're not being considerate. They, are being rude. They're being blunt. Usually that's not what's happening for autistic people. So just having that awareness of those communication styles as a parent, a coworker, a boss, a partner, just simply educating yourself on autistic communication culture will make a huge difference in your relationships. Because as you can imagine, those things escalate quite quickly.
Absolutely. So what I'm gathering over here is that widening our perspective and creating that safe space for people, allowing people to be themselves and not making assumptions. And when you're coming from a place of compassion and no assumption, it creates that safe space for everyone. So, though that's a really powerful insight, and anybody can apply that.
And
So
when you
there is-
connect it to confidence, you can see how, if this is your child or someone you care about, how you would be much more confident in developing vulnerability and connection if you weren't constantly being accused of being a jerk when you were just like asking a question
Right.
or trying to be helpful. That, like, my thought about that Mexico story that I told you was like, I'm helping the whole class. The whole class could walk around thinking Mexico is in Central America. This would be a tragedy. What would happen? And instead of people assuming that I was trying to help the class, they assumed I was trying to embarrass Miss Greco. I was not trying. Embarrassing Miss Greco is the last thing on my mind. I was like, we must correct the record, or the people of Mexico will rise up in protest. So, yeah.
It's just understanding someone else's perspective. And share with us, where can people find you, and tell us about your podcast?
Yeah. So the best way to find me is over at Autistic Culture Podcast. We talk about autism as a culture and introduce you to people like Belle from Beauty and the Beast, and Hans Christian Andersen, who wrote The Ugly Duckling, which is the original autism story and also his story. Thomas Jefferson, one of our founding fathers in America, who is also autistic. And we talk about the autistic influence in Washington, D.C., and then some famous autistics like or autistic hobbies like Pokemon and Dungeons and Dragons and chess. Bobby Fischer, also autistic. So and the inventor of Pokemon. So you could hear about famous people and entertainment in autistic culture. And through those fun stories, it's not sciencey, it's not technical, but you'll learn how to recognize some of those triggers so you could be more loving to yourself if you're autistic, or to the neurodivergent people in your life.
Sounds like the place to go and get a lot of great information, connecting and getting educated, because I believe that education is the light. that can take away the darkness of assumptions and judgments and bring inclusiveness in. So thank you for joining us and sharing your insights.
Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely, because I got educated on quite a few things that I didn't know. So it's important that we continue educating ourselves and keep on bringing that compassion and opening up our wideness of our eyes, not just looking through the lens of what we have been conditioned, looking through the lens of understanding and different perspectives. So thank you. And thank you, listeners, for joining us, because you are the soul of the show. Do reach out to us and let us know how can we support you and how can we help you live the life you deserve. And I wish every one of you happy holidays as they're around the corner, and wonderful times with your families, and happy times, joy and love. And thank you, Juan, for making the show technically possible. We'll see you next time. Be well and take care.
Thank you for being part of Beyond Confidence with your host, Divya Parekh. We hope you have learned more about how to start living the life you want. Each week on Beyond Confidence, you hear stories of real people who have experienced growth by overcoming their fears and building meaningful relationships. During Beyond Confidence, Divya Parekh shares what happened to her when she stepped out of her comfort zone to work directly with people across the globe. She not only coaches people how to form heart connections, but also transform relationships to mutually beneficial partnerships as they strive to live the life they want. If you are ready to live the life you want and leverage your strengths, learn more at www.divyaparekh.com. And you can connect with Divya at contact@divyaparekh.com. We look forward to you joining us next week.